My name is Average Joe.
My name is Beef Pork Ribs. I'm a fine repository of esoteric knowledge, which I suppose most people would qualify as geeky.
Hey, how are ya? My name is Ben, and I am a movie buff.
My name is Asian John.
My name is Pixel Patch.
And my name is Dr. What, and I'm a total nerd, but you wouldn't know it if you met me.
And I'm a proud geek with expertise in movies, superheroes, and animation.
Though I dabble in many fandoms, my main areas of expertise are anime, movies, and Belgian comics, with a strong recent insurgency of D&D.
I am one part video game nerd, one part comic book nerd, but all parts movie nerd.
And I am at best a casual fan, but I do love learning. I know very little about nerd culture, and I'm on a journey to learn and troll people along the way.
I'm a joyful geek with an expertise in gaming, both tabletop and video.
My expertise is in mathematics, history, of course medicine, and all things nerddom.
Our mission is to bring nerd and geek culture to the masses
by sticking it all under the microscope.
Welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast.
Movies, comics, graphic novels, TV, cartoons, animation, nerds are geeks, entertainment culture. Hear it on the Bat Jar, Nerdy Pound. Nerds and geeks, come gather around the scene. Come and join us in the Bat Jar. Come and tune into Average Joe and his team. Lots of room here in the Bat Jar. When the newest nerdy news drops, these podcast pals put it under the scope. DC, Marvel, Disney, Star Wars, cinematic, multiverses, Mega Christmas, strangest franchise. Hear it on the Bat Jar, Nerdy Power.
Hello there, and welcome to the 4th anniversary of the Bat Jar Podcast, where we seem to continue putting nerd and geek culture under the microscope.
Ba, 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 ba. It's not copyrighted anymore, is it? I can't remember. It's a birthday song.
Would we consider the podcast having a birthday or an anniversary? Because I guess it's technically a thing that exists, and so, but it was never. Was it born? Did it? I don't know.
I don't know. I feel like this podcast in some ways is your baby. So, but I don't know if you consider it as such.
Well, people always seem to credit me for creating it, but it can't. And this is a good way to kind of talk today. Is that the podcast came about because Asian John and I were roommates. And I put up all my nerdy stuff on the walls, my geeky stuff on the walls, and I had my big collection of movies and DVDs and whatnot. And he just sort of, out of curiosity, asked about a lot of it, and we ended up watching some stuff together. And I found what he had to say as an adult in his 30s who had never seen, Yu-Gi-Oh! And Dragon Ball Z and a lot of superhero stuff before. I found his opinions very interesting, and doing the research for this week, I was reminded how funny he is, and I thought, hey, it might be a good thing to try and actually park those conversations we were having somewhere where people could listen to, because at that time, nerd and geek culture was becoming more and more mainstream, and I don't know how you were, Beef Pork Ribs, but I was like that person that people knew who was into all this stuff, and so I'd get a lot of questions. Hey, how come there's another Spider-Man in the movies? What does that mean? And so I'd get into explaining the idea of Sony and Marvel being competition and whatnot. So in my thinking was, if I start a podcast where we just have these conversations, I can just direct people to the podcast. I don't have to keep explaining it to people. But, that didn't really work because I quickly realized how jerkish that would be to just say, I already answered this question. Go listen to this podcast about it.
I don't know about that. It depends how niche you are as well, because there's actually one of the people I kind of follow for games on YouTube and a little bit on Twitch. It's for a game called Slay the Spire, but he does a lot of mini videos. Other than streaming, he also does a lot of mini videos that kind of explain certain things about the game, and often he'll get while he's streaming, he'll get the same question over and over and be like, yeah, I actually made a video on this. So I don't think it's necessarily super jerkish. I think if there are some questions that you have been asked a lot, you could say, refer to the podcast, or just give the short answer and be like, but if you want to know more, and then you plug in your podcast and be like, yeah, I did this so that I could answer questions like these. I don't think it's yeah, if you just say, go read the podcast, go listen to the podcast just like that and don't put any more effort into it. Yeah, that could come across as kind of callous and mean, but I don't think it's inherently a bad thing.
Well, I appreciate that, Beef Pork Ribs. And you've been on this journey now for almost a year as a co-host, and you did make your one guest appearance somewhere in there. It's honestly hard for me to believe that it's been 4 years that this podcast has been going on. It just, I don't know, slowly but surely just became part of my regular life to be doing it. And, when we were listening to our old episode this week, I was like, wow, like, I can't believe that was over 3.5 years ago. So certainly for me, the time seems to be flying by. And I know it's been like a shorter amount of time for you, but can you believe it's been almost a year since you came on the show?
Uh, not really. It's hard to believe, especially when like you consider like I don't know. It's a weird like the time has been weird because of like the whole COVID situation and kind of like how it doesn't exactly make your perception of time seem the same as it would have before, I think. But still, yeah, it's pretty crazy that it's already been almost a year.
Well, let's. I don't know how we're going to celebrate. We're not together, and you're in a different city now, and whatever. But metaphorical, here, cheers, whatever.
I
Uh,
lift my glass. Well, it's a cup actually, but I lift my cup to us.
well, I lift the lid of the bat jar.
There you go.
Ben, the movie buff, wanted to be here today, but he couldn't make it, so he actually sent us a message. And Beef Pork Ribs, I'll get you to read it out and do your best to impersonate Ben, the movie buff, as you read it.
Oh man, I haven't heard his voice in like a week. Hey guys, congratulations on your 4 years of the Bat Jar podcast. This is a terrible impersonation, so I'm just going to read it enthusiastically. This is a really cool accomplishment, and I'm glad that the show is still going strong. I think one of the very first episodes of this podcast I listened to was a review of Rogue One. It's been an absolute blast to guest star on the show here and there over the years. I especially had fun during the summer of 2019 when I was a co-host, and also in the spring earlier this year when I got to be a regular host over the course of 8 or so weeks. I hope this show continues to go on for many years. See you in the next one.
Yeah, who knows how much longevity this Bachelor podcast has. We certainly aren't trying to make money off of this. It's not a very professional podcast. And so for those of you who have continued to listen from the beginning or people who are showing up this week for the first time, welcome. We might not sound very eloquent and we might not sound very funny, but we're just a couple nerds and geeks talking about things we love and putting them under the microscope, as the intro likes to remind us. So next week is going to be our 200th episode. So it's always kind of weird. We do about 50 episodes a year. So it's just funny timing that basically our first episode ever came out in October. So it just seems to always happen that like the big landmark number episodes happen around our year anniversary. So this is part one of like a 2-part celebration of the podcast. We'll continue next week with episode 200. But for today, for the 4th year anniversary, we're going to try a new thing on the podcast. We're going to see if this becomes a recurring segment, because now that we've been on the virtual air for 4 years now, we have a lot of content. And when you put out episodes as frequently as we do, like this will be episode 199, there's a lot of things we've talked about and a lot of conversations that we have had over the years. And Beef Pork Ribs, being a newer addition to the show, has not really been had a chance to be a part of a lot of these conversations. So this is a new segment we're going to call What Were We Thinking? The purpose of What Were We Thinking is for Beef Pork Ribs and I to kind of revisit older episodes of the Batch Hour podcast, to revisit the topics and see if our opinions have changed at all since they were originally recorded. And in the case of Beef Pork Ribs, it's his chance to kind of chime in on those topics that he didn't get to be a part of. And I have to admit, this episode that we're talking about today, it was episode 26 of the Batch Hour podcast. It was officially titled Geek versus Nerd, and that came out in April of 2017. So it's been almost, more than 3.5 years since that episode came out. So we're going to do this in a very cliche way. A lot of TV shows, generally when they're hitting a landmark episode, they often do like a clip show where they kind of play clips from the episode to kind of, or different episodes of the show, I should say, to remind you of everything that you've gone through up until that point. And so for those of you who perhaps did not get a chance to re-listen to our episode from way back when, we're actually going to play a part of the conversation for you now. And it's going to kind of inform the conversation we're going to have today. So using the magic of podcast time travel, here's our conversation about nerds and geeks from episode 26.
my thing is like any other, like the way language evolves in general. Then we just kind of know what a nerd is. Most of us most of us kind of agree generally what a nerd and what a not nerd is.
A non-nerd.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so what I found in my research is actually what I was trying to describe was a geek and not a nerd.
Yeah.
And Asian John kept shutting me down. I said, look, that's not what we're talking about. So the idea got put in the bat jar, and last week Asian John pulled it out. So now we're here to talk about the differences between a geek and a nerd. And before I did this research, I would never really assume there was much of a difference. I thought they were just like synonyms.
Now, your research, to be fair, it was other people who have YouTube channels and podcasts, much like you and I. So it wasn't some sort of very in-depth, strong definition there. In fact, I disagree with a lot of what we came across in research.
Oh wow.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So one thing that a lot of the different sources we looked at referenced was this analysis of Twitter that was done, and they researched 2.5.
The graph?
Yeah.
I looked at that earlier today. I was going to bring that up.
So so we can talk about that. So there was this researcher who basically looked at 2.5 million tweets, and they looked at words that appeared in the same tweets as geek or nerd, and so they created this graph that basically showed what words were considered geeky and which ones were more nerdy. And so based on the frequency in which they appeared in a sentence with geek or nerd, they got placed on this graph. What did you guys think about this graph? Did you agree with it? Did you take offense to it?
Well, I noticed the single was on both sides of the spectrum.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, that's right. Oh, yeah, that was there. No matter which side you are. Oh, my goodness, that's funny. So here's one thought that I had, and actually in a question, maybe you can answer this for me, Joe, if you read this in your research. But so the guy doing the research, he was looking at a tweet, and they'd say something like, "Oh, I love Doctor Who." Now, was it that he was looking out for any words or any hashtags that said #nerd or #geek? Is that how he kind of differentiated it?
I believe so. Yeah.
Okay, because
he used.
Well, it could be a hashtag, or it could just be in the tweet at all.
That's right. Yeah. Well, someone would have to put that down, right? Saying that geektastic or nerd or whatnot.
Exactly.
They would use it because that gets me to wonder if people were putting that down. I guess it's really interesting to look at the results, but I wonder if people are using it incorrectly. For example, if someone is so determined a geek is this or a nerd is that I wonder if it's getting their information from that. How reliable is it? Is what makes me wonder. And I do find it really interesting because I was looking on the one side of nerd, and I'm like, that doesn't apply to me. That doesn't apply to me. But then I go to the side of the geek, and I'd be like, oh, Doctor Who, yeah, I love Doctor Who. Star Wars, yeah, I love Star Wars.
You start realizing that it's a lot of sort of in-depth, kind of beyond the normal, I guess, standard deviation of entertainment generally. Except music, I'd say.
Yeah, that's right.
Because there's not music geeks. You know what I'm saying? It's I mean, there's band geeks, but I'm talking about there's not people that are when it comes to contemporary music. Yeah, it's not the same. We don't treat it the same as we treat visual entertainment.
Yes, no, that's right.
It's weird
because in my mind, practicing music is something that takes discipline and essentially study. Right, you have to learn how to be good at something, and you have to play the instrument and practice.
Well, you know what's funny though? Okay, so within the music world, which I'm a lot more involved. I've been in various bands and things like that. It's we don't say we're a nerd or a geek if we're really into our instrument and are really good at it. Okay, but we do use it when it comes to equipment.
Right.
But we would say gear nerd, somebody's a gear nerd.
Right. Okay.
If you're really into your music gear, your pedals, your amp, and the right pickups on your guitar, when you have when you're obsessed with the equipment itself, you're considered a nerd. But it's but it's not a pejorative. It's just kind of the guy, he really knows his gear.
Right. I guess you're saying there would be a difference between knowing a lot about music gear versus how to play music.
Exactly. Exactly. So somebody might be a really good piano player or guitar player, and he wouldn't be, for being good at that, he wouldn't be a nerd.
Right.
But once he gets into all the technical aspects of the equipment, then he's a nerd. He or she is a nerd. But I'd also say that musician nerds tend to be the ones that play speed metal.
Yeah.
Ones that are, just highly technical and fast stuff. Those are nerds. Whereas somebody that plays Bob Dylan style stuff is not a nerd. They're good at songwriting, but they haven't mastered their instrument intricately.
Right. Fair. Yeah.
They can play some chords, or they might even be very good. But you're only a nerd if you're sitting in your room all day doing scales and
you're
nerding out
really into it
on Scandinavian speed metal. You know what I mean? Then you're a nerd.
Yes.
Anyway, that's the music world.
Right.
Cool.
Interesting. Cool.
But we never use the word geek. I don't think.
Interesting. Okay, so all that to say, like looking at that chart, I was able to see, okay, so these words or these ideas or these concepts are more associated with either or.
Yeah.
And for myself, looking at like, yeah, like kind of like you, Ben the movie buff, my interests lied more on the geek side. But so this one article that I'm looking at here, it says like comparing this is how they compare the difference between geeks and nerds, and we'll talk about if we agree with this or not. It says geeks and nerds may share similar outwards traits, but when you compare their approach to life, their differences become apparent. Nerds love to use jargon or unfamiliar terminology in their dialogue, whereas geeks will use obscure references rarely.
Geeks will use obscure references rarely?
Yeah. So the example
They won't use them that often.
the example that I gave last time we talked about this was the whole Wilhelm scream thing.
Okay.
So the nerd would refer to it as an overused Foley effect. So that's kind of like obscure jargon that's more
Right.
technical. Whereas the movie geeks would know what the Wilhelm scream is. It's a
Right.
very famous sound effect. So we refer to it by name. Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. That was good. That was
Yeah,
good.
thank you. Yeah, I've
Yeah,
heard
I
it only
can't-
like 150 times.
Yeah.
Geeks often take interest in the microcosmic details of life, such as noticing that your present situation is like the one from a news article or a novel.
Okay.
Nerds will seemingly be uninterested in the details of daily life, being more focused on the macroscopic, such as scientific possibilities in the future. They think about the big things and not those. They don't think about the day-to-day things as much.
Right.
So they're creating this.
Right. So
distinction.
they're living in their book. They're living in their sphere,
Yeah,
and that tend to be maybe less concerned with the social applications of it.
that's
Yeah.
a good way of
Yeah,
explaining.
maybe. Yeah, because geeks have a whole sort of culture. What we're calling
Yeah.
nerd culture is actually more geek culture.
Yeah.
It sounds like it so
Yeah.
far.
Yeah.
Ben, would you disagree with that at all?
No, I would actually agree. I would want to disagree just because I guess the term nerd I feel like is more popular than geek, right? For example, anytime like if you're watching Big Bang Theory, you're talking about Big Bang
Theory.
yeah, whatever the name of that show is. I would say that they're more commonly referred to nerds as they are than geeks,
Yeah.
right? So that's why I feel like if you ask someone like, what would you consider a geek? They'd either be like, well, I'm not sure. Maybe it's like a nerd, right? Because like nerd has just become more.
I think
way more
that's
common.
that's a fault of the Big Bang Theory. One of the big complaints.
Actually, they're just both in that show.
Well, this
Yeah,
is
no,
the
they
thing
definitely
is
are.
that
Yeah.
people who
Yeah.
are actual real life nerds and geeks hate the Big Bang Theory because they just basically they take every possible nerdy or geeky trait and they just put it onto those characters for the sake of comedy.
Yeah, they've got everything.
So it's
yeah.
They gotta
it's
do the-
unrealistic in the fact that they're super
reductio
into,
absurdum, you know?
everything.
Yeah, they have to be extreme though, maybe they're just trying to get something in there for everybody,
Yeah, that's probably what it
and
is.
they don't care about it being realistic. Like they're actually being people like that, but
Yeah. But no, if I may continue though, I would say that I am inclined to agree that what seems to apply more to a geek would be more like I would apply to that. Whereas the things like being academic and being interested in science and math and space and all that jazz, I'm not as interested in that as a nerd
Right.
would be. So, but then again too, I think like I'm a movie nerd, I'm a movie geek. Like I feel like I like the sound of movie nerd
Yeah.
more, even though I would apply more to a geek. So I'd agree.
But with you, interestingly, because you do work in the industry, all right. So
Yep, that's right.
But the fact that your interest, your deep interest in where you want to spend your life becoming excellent is within the thing that is a geek culture.
Yeah.
So you are kind of both in that area.
Yes, I'd
So
like to think so.
you're a geek because you're interested in all this, film history and all these connections you can make in that world. But you also, it's not just a means as a fan.
Yeah.
For you, it's a means to an end to also being excellent in your area of profession.
And this actually brings in
Both.
the
Yeah.
comparing of interests. This article suggests that a nerd enjoys solitary pursuits like programming, things like The Sims or Second Life, and games like chess or shogi or Go that are kind of like one-on-one solo pursuits. Whereas a geek might enjoy board games, film, and they may follow directors, composers, or key grips obsessively, tech, gadgets, hacking, and techno music. So again, like at least this article is kind of defining nerds more as like introverts or people who like to pursue things on their own, whereas geeks are defined as more social people. Because like Asian John, you love board games.
I do.
I love playing board games. Those are very social things. You can't play a board game by yourself,
Exactly. Yeah.
right?
That's true. Yeah, it's true. I guess the social aspect of it is one of the distinctive markers.
Although what you said though, Joe, a moment ago, made me think of the fact that how you said like, oh, nerds like to do more solitary stuff, right? And they're more introverts, which I like to think I'm kind of both. Like I definitely I can be a social butterfly sometimes, but then other times I feel like, I don't feel like socializing. I just want to stay in or whatnot. And when I went to film school for 4 years, every Thursday or Friday night, regardless whether I was working, because I was a resident assistant at the residence I lived at, regardless whether I was working or not, a lot of people would like go out and be like, "Oh, Ben, you wanna come out? You wanna hang out and go clubbing or go drinking or whatnot?" I'd be like, "Nah, I'm just gonna stay and watch a movie," and I'd usually just stay in and watch a movie by myself.
Yeah.
In fact, if you were to ask me like, "Oh, Ben, what's like the most ideal way to watch a movie?" I'd probably be inclined to say by myself.
Interesting.
Because don't get me wrong, like I love watching movies with my wife, for example, or I love watching a movie with my friends or with my family, but the issue, of course, and any movie nerd / geek can feel my pain, is that sometimes people don't know when to like keep the comments to a minimum, right? And it becomes Mystery
understand.
Science
Oh,
Theater 3000.
you don't order every movie you watch with a commentary track from the people around
Have you ever
I
watched
don't
a movie with Average Joe?
Well, no, the Oscars would be the closest thing we've watched.
I laugh. I make a lot of
No,
noises when I
yeah, it's
laugh,
true. He
but
doesn't- it's not
I
a
don't
lot,
provide unnecessary commentary the whole time.
No. If anything, there are other people that I know that definitely talk. I do as well sometimes. I am guilty of that. But if there's like a movie that I've really been looking forward to see, like even for Star Wars or for Rogue One, and I think heck even both Rogue One and Force Awakens, the people who sat next to me, because I saw it with a number of people, I was just like, hey guys, no offense, but like please don't talk during the movie at all. Like I had to make sure I had to take that extra
Fair
step
enough,
because I don't want there
Yeah, you were
being,
trying to do that during the Oscars too, because everyone was having a.
I was.
You were very patient.
Yeah,
But
thanks.
what if you go to movies where it's like you don't see it as a work of art, you just sort of see it? Like honestly, if I go to like Fast and the Furious movies, like I'll make comments the whole way through because I'm not that interested in the intricacies of the plot.
Yeah.
Whereas if I'm seeing something which is a nerd movie, let's put it that way, or like a geek movie, which the Fast and Furious is not.
Yeah,
those are not nerd.
Well,
geek
movie
movies.
geeks like myself would enjoy those.
Yeah, I enjoy them too. Everyone enjoys them, but we all make fun of how we enjoy them.
Right.
It's like
Yeah.
it's
Or you could
almost
say-
ironic. Like it's like these are terrible movies, awful dialogue, not art at all, but they're just friggin' awesome.
Yeah, but if you're like an action movie nerd or a stunt nerd,
Yes.
for example, you'd really get a kick, like I am, for example, because I love action movies, and
Yeah.
I think that's why I enjoy
Yeah.
Fast and Furious as much as I do.
But would you care about people being quiet for the sake of the dialogue or anything like that?
I once again, it depends. If it's a little thing here and there, I probably won't care. But when it's did this person do this thing? No, he did that.
Oh,
I'm sure
that's
he did this,
annoying.
and like they're actually
Yeah,
having a
yeah,
discussion.
yeah.
It's like, guys, please, like just.
Well, if in movies like that you're confused, that's a
Yeah.
problem. Okay.
No, exactly. But I think for me, it depends. If it's a movie that, like something like Inception, for example, like Inception is something like I'd want to sit down and just focus and watch and pay
It's
attention.
complex, philosophical.
Exactly. Yeah, there's so
Yeah.
much going on. But yeah, something like Fast and Furious, for example, I wouldn't care as much. But on average, like if I'm watching a movie, I'll probably just watch it by myself, unless it's something that, I want this person to watch this movie with me because I want to hear what they have to say. But I feel like just for the sake of simplicity, not have to worry about anyone like talking, because I do know some people that kind of keep on going, and it's like, please stop.
Yeah, I gotcha.
But I mean, you're speaking about in terms of like your social preferences and being introverted. It is not, they're not trying to say that all nerds are introverted and that all geeks are extroverted.
No, but I'd say, certainly with geek topics, there is a much more community. There's much more of a community aspect to it.
Yeah. Right.
Because you want to go and talk to people about movies.
Oh,
you wanna,
exactly, yeah,
but,
for sure.
But nerds, they might want to talk to people who are into the exact same thing they are, but they're not going to have as big an audience of people who care.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? So the geek,
Well, that's the thing is that-
the geek thing can transfer to the mainstream, and you can talk to people who don't know a lot about movies about it, and they may be interested.
Yeah.
Nerd things, it's probably almost so cryptic.
computer programming.
Yeah, it's so cryptic to the average person that we're just like, I'm sorry, I'm not on your level. We have to change topics here.
Yeah,
you know?
not quite there. But I guess, just in short, though, I can definitely apply to the nerd. Yeah, like some nerds being an introvert, I can feel like that's sometimes when it comes to movies, to just have a simple experience of just watching a movie by myself. And if I really liked it and I want to watch it with someone, then I'll share it with them for sure. But yeah, sometimes it's nice.
That's actually one of my favorite things to do, is to take a movie or a show that I really love and to like share it with other people, and kind of like as I'm watching it and getting a new perspective on the product, also seeing their reaction to see if they see the same things I do. You know, I enjoy that kind of like communal experience of sharing it with them.
And because I'm not a geek, when I go to a movie or something like that, and somebody afterwards is like, "Oh, did you notice these things, like little Easter eggs or things that connected to other things within the same universe?" I almost feel like bad that I don't notice it, that I don't know any of that stuff, because I'm like, sorry, like I know you wanted to sort of I know you sort of wanted to sort of bicker back and forth about this, but I have nothing to offer.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned that because it made me think of one of my friends. And if you're listening to this, hey, I hope you're doing well. We watch Futurama every few weeks, right?
I love that.
So yeah, he loves Futurama, and he told me a few years ago. He's like, "Oh, have you ever watched Futurama? We should watch it." So we sit down, and we start watching it. And one of the brilliant things about Futurama, besides it being an enjoyable and entertaining show, is that there are so many references to sci-fi, but also like pop culture and whatnot.
Yeah.
And there was a moment where I think it was in one of the earlier seasons where Bender is wearing an apron, and on the apron it says "To Serve Man." So if any of you guys have ever heard of Twilight Zone, that's the name of one of their most famous episodes, "To Serve Man." Also, like one of like the best twists I've ever seen in a TV episode. So if you ever get a chance, please watch it. But I saw it and I laughed so hard, and my friend didn't get it, right? So he's like, "Wait, what's going on?" I'm like, "That's the name of a Twilight Zone episode, and blah blah blah, and the twist involves this, so that's why he's wearing it as an apron."
So the writers are putting something in there for everyone.
Exactly, yeah.
It's like a Shakespearean, play where there's a level for the proletariat to understand, and there's more complex things for the educated. Right?
Exactly, and the fun thing about watching it is that I get to educate my friend about all these really cool things that.
What
the
if your
show's
friend
doing.
doesn't care?
He does actually. He's
but I'm
he's
saying,
really.
what if? Because I might be the
fair
guy.
enough, yeah.
I might be the guy that's just like, okay, all right.
Yeah, Gage.
That's cool.
Yeah,
cool.
If they're not into it, then that's fine. But I pointed that out a few times to him, and he was like, "Oh, that's really interesting." And he's like, "Ben, yeah, anytime." And he actually had me watch a few Simpsons episodes because he's like, "I feel like this is a reference to something, but I'm not sure what it is." And I watched it for like 30 seconds, and I'm like, "Raising Arizona, Nicolas Cage running with the diapers that he's stealing for his kids that they also stole." And he's like, "Oh, that's so cool." But yeah, so some people are interested in learning about it, and I love sharing that. But if not, then
and
so
that's
be
the
it.
thing is that the article tries to say that geeks essentially have are more social, and they want to try and share what they like with other people.
But did they mention anything about the sort of where this conversation sort of ends? Like we've talked about athletes. Did they even reference that? Like
so this is the thing is like if you go back to the Twitter graph, is that there's different like sports and things don't seem to really appear, but music does. Right.
Which is weird, and I think that goes back to the fact that it's because we kind of know what a nerd is or a geek is, or if you interchange the two, you just kind of know that world because it doesn't apply to everything. It doesn't apply to athleticism for whatever reason. So it's like no matter how well you think if you define these two terms, geek and nerd, we just know what's not that.
Yeah.
We just know that. We know that LeBron James is not a nerd. We just know that. Like if they're like.
So I might be full of movie trivia, and I'll be considered a movie geek. But then Joe Schmo, who's a big hockey fan, is full of hockey trivia, and he's not considered a sports geek.
You know what? If they're really into the trivia, maybe, or they're really into stats. If they know a lot of stats by heart, I could see a case for that. But if they themselves put all their life's work, let's say, into being excellent at a sport, it's not the same as spending your whole life to be excellent at electronics.
Right.
The electronics guy is a nerd. The guy that's the athlete is not. Even though he might have put equal or more effort into being excellent in that
I
area.
guess because in defining nerd, that like academics are very emphasized.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's a good point. And ultimately, maybe the blurring comes in like if you're talking about fans.
Right.
Because the term fan can be used to describe all these things.
Yeah.
But going back to the graph, some kind of broad categories, they say collections are geeky. So anything from like a box set to having a collection or collectibles, which if you look around this apartment, I totally don't have collectibles all over the place.
Nope, bare walls all around.
That is a lie, everyone.
Yeah, I know. There's awesome artwork. I love it.
Academic fields are nerdy, so math, history, physics, biology, neuroscience. Words like Harvard, study mode, thesis. Are nerdy.
Okay.
Computers and technology. So these are things that actually kind of fit into both categories.
Okay.
Actual how computer stuff gets done stuff, like programming, that's more nerdy.
Right.
But then things like Apple are considered geeky, like being really into Apple.
It's almost more like geeky is it's almost like a subset of hipster in that sense.
So like things like Geek Squad from Best Buy, they're the people that come to your house and help you solve your tech problems. Like
but what about Nerd Herd from Chuck?
That's right, Nerd Herd from Chuck. Yeah, man.
I have no idea what you guys are talking about.
Hi, my name's Chuck. Here,
never mind. It's a show.
That's right. Yeah, it's a really
I know what
nerdy
Chuck
TV
is,
show.
but I don't know.
Yeah. And he worked at a store like like
Yeah, a Buy More, kind of like a Best Buy and a Staples combined. So
But they
instead
call
of
it
the
the
Geek
Nerd
Squad,
Herd.
yeah, they
Yeah.
call it the Nerd Herd.
Oh,
Yeah.
interesting. Okay, there's some blurring
Well,
there.
okay,
Yeah.
this gets me really thinking. So, okay, not really think it's not that profound, but
somewhat thinking.
AJ, what I wonder is, okay, we always say we're talking about nerd culture, blah blah blah. As it turns out, we're really talking about geek culture. Would you say that in a category in which you are a nerd, would you say you're like a spreadsheets nerd? Like, is there an area that you have?
I enjoy, like, it's part of my job. I do some data analytics and stuff like that. But I don't go down the rabbit hole enough to be obsessed with it. I don't.
Right.
Oh, okay.
I'm not
Yeah.
as technical about it.
Are you a nerd in any? Would you, with the definitions we're working with, do you think you're a nerd in any particular area?
I got it. Like even like academics, it's like, yeah, I got like straight A's in high school, but I feel like a
Yeah.
lot of that was just I just seemed to be naturally
Intelligent and good
I
with
didn't.
school,
I
yeah.
honestly didn't put a whole lot of effort into studying. My parents could probably attest to that. So I don't enjoy studying. I don't enjoy academia. You know, I went to university, but I was happy to get out of there as soon as I could.
Yeah.
Oh, right. Yeah.
I didn't enjoy the learning process. I didn't the idea of learning.
I think a lot of nerds don't like it unless it's in their particular area too, though. You hear about the geniuses of the world, and they were very specialized.
That's
and
the thing. They're
terrible at everything
dedicated
else.
to studying and to learning and
Do you think
growing.
Einstein was good at poetry? I mean, no. I mean, like, probably not.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would say based on the conversation, but like I'm even looking hobbies. Hobbies for geeks are things like toys and manga, and nerdy ones are chess and Sudoku. Like I hate doing Sudoku because it
Interesting. So-
involves math, and
Yeah.
Interesting. That's
whereas
nerdy.
I own collectible toys that are
Yeah.
based on certain things, and I've read manga. I definitely enjoy those things more. So I think what we're concluding to here is that.
yeah.
The intro to our show is a lie, and our tagline is a lie because
Yeah.
in actuality,
Let's stick with it, though. Let's stick with it.
Yeah.
Because you know what? After this conversation, if we've done anything, it's actually muddied the waters even more.
Well, exactly. Yeah.
We're not.
From the
I don't have
research,
clarity.
from the research I did earlier today, if there's anything that I learned, it's that a number of different people and a number of different sources have various definitions of nerd versus geek. But I'd like to think that if you are someone, like one of the definitions I saw that I liked, but once again, it's pretty broad,
still, yeah.
is, you know, if you are someone who's like really dedicated, really interested into something, and it's not just so much like, oh, yeah, like learning about like Game of Thrones, for example, right? Oh, yeah, Game of Thrones, they're these characters, and it's a fun show, and there's a lot of hopping back and whatnot. You know, you wouldn't be considered a nerd, but if you're like, oh, I've read in all these theories, and here are all the different characters, here's the history, here's the lore, I've read all the books, I've watched the show, like there are comics, I've read those too. Like then you'd be like, okay, you're a nerd for sure. But once again, yeah, like it just it gets complicated.
Don't you think we just kind of there's more of an intuition to knowing what a nerd / geek is,
Yeah.
and they're kind of more interchangeable than people want to make them sound.
I would, yeah.
All right, welcome back to the present or the past or the future, whenever you're happening to listen to this episode.
Wouldn't really be
before-
the future ever.
Well, you know, people in the future could be listening to this, right? Because it's the future for us. Does that still check out?
Not in the context of what you were saying, but sure, let's go for it.
All right, so before Griff, I want to throw it to you first. Since you weren't on that episode talking about nerds and geeks and trying to define those terms, how do you feel about the topic, or do you perhaps you disagree or agree with what we said in the episode?
It's an interesting thing. Like, there's a lot of what you guys said that I kind of see as being true, but I think a lot of what I found my comments were on the conversation is that you guys spoke a lot more about the distinctions that kind of currently exist, and a lot less about kind of like, if you will, the history of it, because I feel like that's the thing, is that nerd and geek kind of are from different time periods and meant different things at different times. Like right now, like the definition that you guys talked about, where like nerd is a bit more like stuck in their own world and doing things that are a little more individual, and you kind of went around with like it's maybe a bit more of a personality thing. I think was also is something that's a little bit more like true today when we're talking about nerd and geek. But I think that even if you just look at it, nerd never got the kind of like reappropriation, if you will, of the word that geek did, where it was like, no, it's not a derogatory word. It's just a way to describe something. I think that nerd never really got that, whereas geek kind of, they pushed that forward. And that's why now we differentiate nerd and geek a lot more, even though, you know, there are some times where geek was purely pejorative, like being called geeko in high school. I mean, who could survive such an insult? Yeah, I think it was like it's interesting, like because I think that the whole nerd versus geek thing is less of a distinction of terms and more distinction of time when those terms were more popular, more commonly used, and who used them. Because like I feel like when I was a kid I said I was a nerd. Now I say I'm a geek, not because well the way I am has changed a little bit, which is why I don't totally discount the whole like kind of personalities or different different approach to life, because I did used to be a lot more introverted and a lot more in my own head when I was a kid. But I think it's also just geek became a more popular term, and that's why we use it more to mean very similar things. Um, but when we talk about geek culture, it is something that isn't exactly what geek was being used at before, because when you think of somebody who's geeky, there's still that image of the nerd, the kid with the glasses is just doing his own thing who snorts a lot, Urkel.
So, if I'm trying to understand, are you saying that we, in our conversation, we didn't consider like the historical use of those terms as much as we did just like how they're being used right now and how that informed how they're being used now?
Yeah, or not even necessarily that it informs how they're being used right now, but to see maybe there is less of a distinction overall, because historically they're just different terms used at different times. Yes, they were used simultaneously for a lot, but I feel like looking at the history of it would have been, I think, a worthwhile investment to give a little bit more depth to the conversation.
Interesting. I know, listening back from myself, I realized that in that episode, I'm trying very hard to come up with a very defined definition for both terms. Like I was convinced that they were different things, and I wanted Asian John and Ben the movie buff to agree with me. And Asian John was not having it. He was like, "No, like we're just muddling the waters here even more, and that these things sound the same." And even Ben was kind of on the same page as well. So I see now how hard I was trying to get them to agree with me that the things that they were two different, like that they were generally two different things. But at the end of the conversation, we still kind of were left in the same spot where, well, you know what, like it all kind of blends together and it's all subjective anyway. But where would you say you fall? Do you agree with them in the sense that they're really interchangeable, or are you thinking kind of like I did at the time, where they are different boxes?
I think again, like I think nowadays they are slightly different boxes, but I don't think that there's enough of a difference that we would like as a term to define a person. I don't think there's enough of a difference to make a difference of term at this point. Um, but I do think that they have slightly different connotations, which when talking to somebody you could use. Like I feel like nerd is still more of an insult than geek is. Um, and that's just, kind of how it goes. But I don't think that that's something that necessarily lasts either. Like I feel like it's nerd might come to mean something different, but people don't really use nerd much anymore. So like I think it's more like a personal definition for the people on whether it is a pejorative term or just a kind of way to describe yourself. But I don't think I think I'm more on their side, where it's like they're pretty interchangeable.
Yeah, I guess it's part of just my personality that I like having like clearly defined meanings for different words. I don't like having things that are overtly synonymous. And I think I was probably discounting, I mentioned personality, but I was most likely discounting various personality types and temperaments when I was in trying so hard to define the difference between nerds and geeks, because I really painted with a broad stroke that essentially nerds are introverts and geeks are extroverts. And I think I might have said, oh, like, you can be one or the other, but really, if you're trying to define these words so clearly and using those kind of descriptions to differentiate them, if a geek is meant to be somebody who's social and wanting to, build community and bring people into what they're interested in, it's, I would imagine, very hard to like also consider that to be somebody who is introverted and where it does not get energy from being around other people.
I think that the biggest difference for me personally, the best distinction that you guys made for the two was not necessarily as much introvert and extrovert, but in I do believe it was either you who brought it up or actually Asian John, I think, was. Or maybe it was Ben the movie buff. Now that I think about it, somebody said that it's not necessarily less about introvert and extrovert, but they explained it as kind of the way to associate with the world, or the way that we understand the world. And it was that nerds are kind of stuck in their own world, regardless of like how social you are. These are things that can still happen whether you're an introvert or an extrovert. Is that nerds tend to not be able to read the world as well and not associate with real things as much as fictional things. And then geeks also tend to have a difficulty in some ways associating with the real world, and they do it through the bias of whatever their geekdom is. So for example, if you've ever watched Community, Abed would be, by that definition, the quintessential geek, because he doesn't understand the real world except through the example of TV shows and movies. And whereas I'm trying to think of a good example of a nerd from pop culture, but unfortunately a lot of them get kind of mixed in with other things. But the nerd would be somebody who doesn't even have that level. They just don't really understand the world or want to associate with it or even care. I think that's also a big difference, is that like the geeks are using their geekdom to try to understand the world or try to fit in, whereas the nerds wouldn't actually care that they understand how the world works or that they fit in at all. Which again, that's what I base myself on when I was talking about, like, when I was younger, I considered myself more of a nerd and now more of a geek, because when I was a kid, I read a lot of books. I had a lot of hobbies that were not that were to be done alone, but that really didn't have to do with real life. A lot of imagination games, a lot of reading stories, a lot of being stuck in fiction, a lot of things that don't actually necessarily help you. And I didn't read stories and then make up games based on those stories so I can better understand people or be able to like work through some real world issues. For example, it was just, purely for myself. And so in the sense, like, I think that's a better explanation than the introvert extrovert, because I know nerds who are extroverted, right? They do a lot of things. They don't really understand the world, but they love being around people. They're just not very good at it. Just like I know some geeks who are extremely introverted. They will geek out online or do a lot of things about, and they'll only be able to talk about certain subjects, but they still hate hanging around people or don't really get their energy from being around a lot of people. And I think also maybe I'm reading more into the definition of introvert extrovert, which I think is often poorly defined. And that might also be why I think that like your approach to the world is the bigger difference.
And so I don't think we really touched this in the previous conversation, but I think as I'm like now forming my opinion again years later, I think you can be a nerd or a geek about different things. So if I think of myself, I would probably be an anime nerd in the sense that to me it's something I kind of do on my own and I don't talk to other people about it, and I might read news websites or experience it and watch it for my own enjoyment, and I'll learn about how it's made and all that kind of stuff. But very rarely will I ever actually talk to somebody else about that. And so to me, it is like more or less a solitary interest, and occasionally I'll talk to somebody else about it, but admittedly, I like to talk to people about anime who also know what I'm talking about. Like, it's not as fun to talk to somebody who's not invested in anime already about it. Whereas with like superhero stuff, I'm a huge evangelist in that sense. I want to get other people invested. I'm like telling parents to like introduce it to their kids and to, I'm more than happy to answer anyone's question about a superhero thing for the sake of trying to get them invested in that world. And I love, even yesterday I was watching Avengers Infinity War with somebody who had never seen it before. And I like was like really excited to like share that experience with them. So when it comes to like superhero stuff, I would very much call myself a geek.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting. Like, yeah, I definitely don't think like if you do give a different, even like any of the definitions that you guys have had given in there and that we've talked about that are different, I don't think any of them are ever mutually exclusive. I think it's a lot more about kind of like the difference in how you define it might make you feel differently about certain subjects, and some of them do lend themselves a little bit better to the word geeky or the word nerdy. Um, yeah, and I'm also just like remembering. I was sorry, I was reading through Ben the Movie Buff's comment that he had made about the episode. I might read it and then uh, give a few more comments about, because I did very much like the nerd versus geek, but you guys spent a lot of time. Like, that was, I think, the first thing I noticed was how long you guys talked about like the movie previews. I guess we haven't done it a lot since I've been the co-host because of COVID, and much fewer movies are actually coming out. But I did like that kind of conversation at the beginning, talking about you know the movie previews and how they felt about it.
Well, that's fun. Yeah, we'll go ahead and read Ben's comments, but just to comment on that, that was something we did a lot in the earlier days of the podcast, was like reacting to movie trailers and stuff that were coming out. And I was trying very hard to be super cool in my editing, so I like made sure to edit in sound clips of like everything we were talking about. And for one, I found that became a little time consuming, and I'm like, maybe I'm trying, like this is me being a try hard, just like, ooh, look at me, I can edit in sound clips. And then even that, like I kept hearing from people our podcasts were too long, and so I'm like, okay, maybe one way to leave more room for our actually like feature conversation is to like dial back on extra stuff, because we used to cover the news a fair bit, and that ended up being like, yeah, half our runtime was talking about news items, which included trailers. So people listening, let us know if you want us to go back to doing more of that, because I'll certainly happily talk about trailers, and sounds like beef pork ribs will as well.
Yeah, and I think it's also just like it also gives maybe even a bit more variety instead of sticking to one subject completely. Not that I mind that, and there are definitely some subjects I could talk about forever and ever. I mean, the first time I was on an episode was for One Piece, and I mean, I could talk for hours about One Piece, and I know I'm not the only one, because like there are, I mean, the One Piece podcast is what, like a 4-hour podcast every week talking about just the episode and chapter that came out that week. So like it's pretty crazy.
All right, so yeah, Ben the Movie Buff also sent us some comments on the specific episode. So
Comments from Ben on the topic. It's fun to listen to this episode because it being my first time on the show, I was definitely a little nervous, and that's probably the reason why I'm rambling and also stumbling over my words. Side note from JP, I still do that. It's okay, Ben, don't worry. Back to Ben. It's also fun to listen to myself talk, because when I get asked a certain question, I try to remember how my past self is about to answer, and sometimes I get it right. I find I'm very responsive in this episode. I say these things a lot when other people are talking. Yeah, right, cool, okay. Listening to our discussion on nerd versus geek, it seems that my thoughts about how I enjoy watching a movie hasn't changed much in 3.5 years. I'm a nerd in that sense, and I like to watch movies and learn about film facts and history by myself. And I'm definitely a film geek in how I like to discuss movies with other people and also experience certain films with my friends or family. When Average Joe says, "What, you don't order a commentary from the people around you when you watch a movie?" it made me laugh again.
yeah, that was another perk, if you will, of everyone recording in person, is because we were all using the same equipment. It was easier for us to talk over each other. But unfortunately, using Zencastr, it kind of jarbles the sound quality when we talk over each other. So we're much more polite and making sure we don't talk at the same time.
Yeah, that last thing he said reminded me of something that I had written down when I was I had this little thing. I wanted to write a bunch of things while I was listening to the podcast, but I ended up only writing 3. The first time I said way more time spent on trailers. I did note that Ben the Movie Buff said Age of Ultron was decent. I was going to fight him on it, but he's not here this week. Age of Ultron was not decent. It was a horrible dumpster fire. But also, somebody dissed Art Attack. It was you, Joe. You said that Art Attack was not on the same level as Beast Wars, and I cannot believe you said that. What were you thinking? Art Attack is a tremendous show. It is hilarious, it is entertaining, and it is super impressive.
And it was aired on YTV.
Oh,
that's right,
YTV.
YTV,
Okay,
that's right.
I
Yeah.
confuse those things.
TVO was like a public broadcaster for the province
right,
of
yeah, like
Ontario.
Arthur,
they
Magic
would
School
never
Bus,
get anything as
Tengu.
cool as Beast Wars.
What are you talking about? Didn't they have like the art guy or whatever?
Oh, Bill, not the, no, not Bill.
the art
no,
show.
Art
or-
Attack with
Art Attack.
with-
Don't put Art Attack in the same category as Beast Wars.
Hello again, it's me, the head.
Listen. As a kid, I spent like 6 months in Canada.
You really want to put Art Attack on the same level as Beast Wars? Probably the greatest Transformers series there ever has been.
I mean, yeah. Have you look? Few things. Number 1, have you looked at the animation of Beast Wars recently? Okay.
Well, we did an episode on it at some point. Yeah, it's not as good in season 1, but it gets better.
Not as good. It's like reboot levels. Like, that's terrible. Whereas Art Attack is still just as good as it used to be, right? It hasn't aged poorly. And the second thing is that as great as Beast Wars may have been, it hasn't left, I don't know, I feel like Art Attack has left an enduring mark on a lot more people, not just like for being, semi-educational, but also like motivate people to try to do cool things, like go outside and try to make a giant, art that looks like a tiger just by placing, binders on the ground. I think honestly, in a different way, it is superior to Beast Wars, but generally speaking, no, you're right. It's not on the same level of geek culture, maybe. But I think it's also like a big get for like a Canadian show that did very well.
Yeah, I think we'll have to make that an episode at some point. Beast Wars versus Art Attack. That'll really get people's attention. Yeah, just to comment on like the editing of the episode we were talking about. Back then, I was really afraid of there being any silence in the episodes, so I literally decreased the amount of silence between people speaking to be as minimal as possible. And listening back to it, I'm like, this sounds a little overproduced. Like, it's like as soon as one person stops talking, the next person starts. And so I think I've learned since then that it's okay for there to be some silence in your episode, because it did admittedly, I was like, do I have it on fast forward or something? Because people are talking real fast here.
Yeah, I did notice that as well. But I think it's also, like, it's not necessarily a bad thing to have. And, sorry, it was early days, which means that we learn from our mistake. And that's why we're doing this, too. Not just to have my comments on subjects that are long gone, because I don't think my opinion is worth that much. But I think retrospectively looking at what you've done and what we can do, I think is a lot more helpful.
And I think one last thing just to comment on revisiting the topic is we did try to tie in music and sports into the conversation about what a nerd or geek was. And at the end of the day, I think what that really opened up is the idea of defining what a fan is, because we seem to agree that people who are into sports on a fan side would display a lot of the things we would consider nerdy or geeky, but because sports is so dissociated from what we consider to be a nerd or a geek, they can't be the same thing. And so I actually want to do another episode at some point on the defining the word fan and saying, like, is there, because I'm convinced that somewhere somebody who's super into sports and someone who's super into comic books are actually the same kind of person. They just express it differently. And I think fan might be the word to group those together.
And again, I do think that, like, the idea that geek was something that was taken back and is no longer regarded as much as an insult has opened up to people being like, yeah, I'm a sports geek, because, it's not completely uncool to be a geek anymore, so being a sports geek isn't as weird.
Wonderful. So there you go. That has been What Were We Thinking on the topic of nerd versus geek. I don't know if we've come to any more conclusions since then. I still like to think they're different, and I kind of have in my head, I see myself as a nerd in some respects and geek in some other respects, which is why in the show's intro now we talk about nerd and geek culture, because originally we just said we were part of nerd culture, so we kind of do both now.
I think that distinction is also broadening all of our horizons, like trying to see how many more things we can touch. And it also means that we can talk about anything that might be featured on the Big Bang Theory without worrying if it's nerdy or geeky.
So happy 4th anniversary to you, Beef Pork Ribs. It's been a pleasure to have you here, and we're going to keep the celebration going next week for the episode 200.
If you want to reach the show, you can send us an email at
batjarpodcast@gmail.com.
or you can tweet us at
The Bat Cookie Jar.
You can find the Bat Jar Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, including YouTube, because we got a channel. Share our posts on Facebook, write reviews, give our shows a rating. This will help all people join us inside the Bat Jar, and we appreciate it dearly.
We're not going to tell you guys what we're going to be talking about next week. We'll keep that a surprise, but rest assured it'll be significant, I suppose, in some respects, and relevant for the days we live in. So until next week, when we celebrate our 200th episode, I'm Average Joe.
I'm Beef Pork Ribs.
Catch you on the flip side.
We're steadily getting as many episodes as One Piece.